Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and today my guest is former CIA counterterrorism officer and founder of Famil, a national nonprofit organization which provides support to Afghan allies, particularly members of the Zero units, Geeta Bakshi. Geeta, I should have said your name before beginning to talk about all the wonderful things
That's
that
all
you do.
good.
But if you guys were here, it feels like 5 years ago, but it was 8 months ago, I think, Geeta, that you came on for the first time. And that I know it literally, I can't believe it was only like 8 months, but we were talking about the Zero units, who are elite Afghan forces supported and trained by the CIA. And at the time, that was a really important story. And now it's an even more important story. And so we're going to revisit some of the things about what the Zero units have been involved in and talk about what they're facing now, all these months later. And I should mention, too, Geeta is a 14-year veteran of the CIA herself and spent several years of her career in Afghanistan. That was the most hideous introduction I've ever done, and I hope that you will forgive me.
That was beautiful, Beth. Thank you so much. You're very kind. Thanks for having me on tonight.
Oh my gosh, I'm so stoked. It is an honor, and I'm
Likewise.
so enamored of everything that you have done for the Zero units and with FAML and all the people who, this is something that is vital. And I've heard you talk about why it's vital, and it touches my heart. And I'm sure you're going to say some of those things today, and I know that they will touch listeners' hearts too. So I think the best place to start is somewhere we didn't talk about last time you were here, which is what the Zero units did. We're right here. We're recording this on the 7th of August, but by the time that it comes out, we're going to be at the 4 year anniversary. 4 years ago. I still can't believe it. Um, and the Zero units played such a vital role in the withdrawal. And I would love for you to talk at whatever length you're able to about what the Zeros did at HKaya. And basically, I think by listening to that, listeners are going to understand, we couldn't have done what we did without the Zero units.
Yep,
So
yep,
go for it, Geeta. Tell,
absolutely.
tell us.
Well, first of all, again, thanks, Beth, for having me on. It's just a pleasure to be able to spend this time with you. And you're right, it's 4 years. I look at our own journey like 4 years ago, right around this time. Um, I was coming back from some time off with my family, and I remember it was the 15th of August when I got that first phone call from a friend on the ground, and I'll share it. It was a friend of mine she's an American citizen that had gone back home with her 10-year-old son, also an American citizen, to visit their family in Kabul. Um, their family had had multiple children, adult children, serve with the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence community. And she called me on the 15th of August, and I just remember the panic in her voice. She said, the Taliban's taken over the city. She was at the hospital at the time, and she was like, I don't know what to do. I'm having a panic attack. I need to make it home. And she meant home to her parents, but then also home to America. And I remember that first phone call is what set off a chain of events that week. And then lo and behold, it was on the 19th of August that we launched FAMIL, with the idea that we would be helping a community of special immigrant visas, or SIVs, that were exfiltrated from Afghanistan to the United States. The community that kind of inherited FAMIL happened to be the National Strike Unit, or the Zero units. And here we are 4 years later, still working through a lot of immigration cases, still helping our folks find their footing here in the US, and at the same time being part of that journey of success for so many of them that have gotten through the immigration process and have rebuild their lives here. So yeah, 4 years. I think um, I want to just take 1 second to thank everybody who's working in this space, all the nonprofits working tirelessly around the clock, advocates, folks like you, Beth, that are helping get the stories out there, um, our congressional partners, folks within both admins that have really put in a lot of hard work here. There's still more work to do. I know you recently spoke with No One Left Behind. Famil and No One Left Behind have a lot of overlap in this space. And we're excited to continue moving forward and do good things for our community. So all that to say, thank you, Beth. Um, Really, I think, when I look at the 4-year anniversary of the withdrawal, one thing that stands out to me is that there were a lot of heroes at the withdrawal, and we've heard some of their stories. Obviously, we've heard the horrific tragedy with our 13 service members that were lost at Abbey Gate, as well as the survivors who have struggled and continue to struggle, as well as the heroes that help get so many American citizens and civilians out of harm's way. But one group of heroes, and perhaps unsung heroes that we don't hear too much about, are the NSU, or the Zero Units. And I'm excited to talk about them today. Um, Going back to, I was just telling you, the 15th of August, um, what was happening around that time is, as HKIA had been overwhelmed with civilians that were already on the airfield, that were perhaps looking to travel out of the country, either to flee the country. Some of them already had flights out of the country. But the first task was really to clear the airfield and secure it. And that's kind of where the Zero Units got involved for the first time, was getting to the airport and teaming up with the U.S. military that was already there and helping clear this massive airfield. And from what I've learned, it was not an easy task. There were, threats inside the airfield that had to be removed, safely removed, sent out to the airfield. And that was kind of some of the first task that the Zero Units had, was essentially secure this airfield, clear it up so that we know that the inside of the airfield is secure. And then, of course, thereafter, this was probably August 16th. Thereafter, there was this 2-week long evacuation. The Zero Units, just, for your listeners' frame of reference, these were the folks that served very closely with the U.S. intelligence community. They supported U.S. counterterrorism efforts for 2 years, or sorry, for 2 decades of the war, for 20 years of the war. And they were on the front lines. When we talk about the tip of the spear, these were the guys on the tip of the spear, guys and gals in some cases. And they did this day in and day out for 20 years. This was not a 6-month deployment in and out. This was their life. Some of them literally worked for 20 years, others of them 10 or 15. And they more than proved their loyalty to the United States on the battlefield. They saved countless American lives, often at great personal loss, including, those that were injured and in some cases killed in action. So when it came to, this massive evacuation, this disastrous withdrawal, it made sense that the U.S. government looked to some of their most capable partners, and that's why the NSU was called to take this task. Again, for a frame of reference, the NSU, or the Zero Units, their responsibility was to secure both the inner sections of the airfield as well as parts of the perimeter that had been unoccupied at that point, right? So the U.S. military obviously had some of the perimeter covered, including Abbey Gate, but there were other parts of the perimeter that were completely unmanned and could have been, could have posed real vulnerabilities in terms of the enemy or even malign actors getting into the airfield. So, very soon after arriving to HKIA and securing the inner compound, the Zero Units took part of the perimeter. And from there on, for 2 weeks, These guys and gals worked around the clock, much like our own U.S. forces did, without sleep, without food, without water. Um, they not just secured the perimeter of the airport, but they were actually going undercover into the crowds to link up with American citizens and securely escort them onto the airfield. Um, and they did this extremely effectively because they knew their own country, they knew that operating space, they knew how to navigate the crowds and get from, point A to point B securely, link up with American citizens and bring them into the airfield. Um, they often worked, like I said, with no sleep. Unfortunately, some of them were injured at HKIA. Um, and, you know, along with the U.S. service members that were lost at Abbey Gate, some of the Zero units did suffer casualties, um, including one that was killed in action at HKIA as well. Um, and, as tragic as we think Abbey Gate was probably one of the biggest tragedies of this war, had it not been for the Zero units, we may have suffered even bigger casualties during that 2 week evacuation. These guys were really the first line of defense for the part of the airfield that they were assigned to cover. And so being that first line of defense came very naturally for them. It was, their part of their ethos is protecting and defending their U.S. advisors. And so that was, that was a critical part of what they did for 20 years. And certainly they continued that in that 2 week period. Um, it's interesting because, the first couple of years and even now, I get the opportunity to sit with the folks from this community and talk to them. And, they almost always remember HKIA. They remember the withdrawal. They remember that really difficult period in their lives because, we saw tens of thousands of civilians trying to get into HKIA to leave the country. And with the Zero units, for some of them at least, it was almost the opposite. They wanted to stay and fight. They wanted to stay and protect and defend two countries, the United States and their own country. They wanted to protect the innocent lives that had been affected by this war and by terrorism for so long. So for them, it's a little bit of a different experience. It was like, okay, we're leaving. And within a unexpected period of time, you're suddenly homeless, jobless, and countryless. And very quickly put on the back of planes and exfiltrated to the US. And I say exfiltrated because the Zero units, because of their affiliation with the US government, because of the work they did, they really had a huge target on their back. It was very apparent to both the Afghan government and the US government that if the Zero units were not exfiltrated, they would have bore the maximum risk and the maximum casualties from Taliban retaliation or execution. So these guys and gals were exfiltrated. They were, first of all, they were qualified and eligible for the Special Immigrant Visa program, for the SIV program. They met, for at least the majority of them met that threshold, the requirement of 1 year loyal and faithful service, unquestionably. So they were already eligible for that, but there was also a real threat to their lives. And so, this was not a run for the airport. This was we need to get these folks out of here and get them to safety. And so, as difficult as it was for so many that I've spoken to, they're extremely grateful to be here. They're, incredibly appreciative for the US government and for Americans for embracing them here. Yet they're still the unsung heroes from this, which is why we're talking about it. And I certainly want to recognize their sacrifices along with our own US forces that contributed to keeping America safe despite how difficult this withdrawal was.
Yeah. And, by the time that this comes out, I don't think that Chris Robinson's episode will be out yet either. And he sat with me and for 2 hours traced just the events of August 15th and 16th. And There are a lot of people who will say a lot of things about the zero units, but they aren't people who talked to anyone on the ground at HKIA. Chris Robinson has talked to 70 people who were on the ground at HKIA or involved in operations at HKIA and has collected 300 hours of testimony on this subject. And he talks about the zero unit's indispensable work to clear that airfield. And, and that's from the people who were there, who told him about this. So it was vital at the time when our people were getting overrun. The zeros were in there clearing the space and making sure it was safe for us. And they were, it's like you said, they weren't going to the airport to get on a plane. They were taken to the airport to make sure it was safe for other people to get on planes.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can share the story of the individual who was killed. I don't think I had any idea that happened. Are you able to say anything about just the circumstances of that and what was going on?
Obviously, I wasn't there on the ground, so it's hard for me to give you kind of a firsthand account. But from what I've gathered from talking to different folks, and not just from the zero units, but from other folks that were on the ground, this was a lot of chaos. There was friendly fire, unfortunately, and in this case, it was a friendly fire incident. Several of them were injured. One of them was killed. Famil works actually with one that was severely injured. We still work with him here in the U.S. He's been through a lot of surgery, a lot of difficulty, but he's alive, luckily. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate this happened, but you had a lot of friendly forces at that airfield, U.S. and foreign forces, and unfortunately, there was chaos at times. I've had the opportunity to see footage from on the ground that folks recorded on their own, on their own devices, and I just cannot imagine being in that chaos, just the environment, the number of people there, the heat, the pressure, the chaos, the not knowing what's happening. And somewhere in there, unfortunately, there was friendly fire incident and one of them was killed in action.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And I wonder too, I've been going back to a lot of my old reporting lately, and one of the earliest stories was about a woman whose husband was killed by the Taliban, and he would have been an SIV eligible Afghan, and she couldn't apply for the program, was what I was told at the time. But she should have been able to. People should be able to apply based on a spouse.
Oh yeah,
who
definitely.
worked. And so has the family, at least, of that NSU member been able to get?
Yeah, no, as far as I know, no. Yeah, as far as I know, they haven't. But you are right. There is part of the SIV program is, for surviving spouses, there is a way to apply for that. We have had other families within the zero units who are surviving spouses whose husbands were killed in action. They're here in the US. They have been able to apply and get through that process. But no, not for that one individual.
Yeah, it's all so. At that time, I think the story was told to me in like January of 22. So it was just the Wild
quite
West
frankly,
of what's happening, right?
Beth, this is the first time probably this is being talked about publicly. I don't think we've ever discussed this friendly fire incident, which a handful of the guys were wounded, one severely wounded, like I said, and one killed in action. And this is where I say the unsung heroes, right? It's part of their ethos. They work in the shadows. They're not trying to be famous or get a pat on the back. It's just what they did. It's part of their service. And but I think it's important to recognize them and not just them, but the US advisors that worked with them in that really, really difficult time.
Sure. And you said this to me when we were working, when you were talking to me about an article that I wrote recently with the zero units included, that without them there would have been more stars on the CIA wall. And I could, I could feel the emotion in your voice when you said it, and can you talk a little bit about, because I think that even if all they did was secure HKIA and keep people from meeting an untimely end
Yep.
uh, by the Taliban's hand. They just, oh gosh, the anger is rising. But anyway, that would be enough that they should be afforded stability in our country. But that isn't all
Mhm.
they did. As you said, many of them worked for, however many years. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that they did, and the kind of
Yeah.
vetting too, if you're able to talk about that they were
Yeah.
able to get, because vetting is such a hot button topic
It
for
is.
populations, and it should be. We
Yep.
want to vet people and make sure, especially in a country that has so many um, the Taliban are tied to a lot of people,
Yeah.
and it's very difficult to figure out who is tied to the Taliban sometimes, but not not so with the zero units.
Yep. Yep.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Let's talk about the vetting. Um, Vetting was a continuous process for these units. It wasn't just a background check before you get hired. It was a background check. It was, going through the biometrics process. It was going through interviews constantly. Within each of the units, they kind of had their own, what you would think of, like kind of an internal security system. So there was constantly vetting happening, quite frankly, through the very end of the war. Remember, like I said, most of these folks were eligible for SIV. So that also was, vetting was required to get through the SIV process as well. And knowing that the withdrawal was coming at one point, these folks got re-vetted ahead of the withdrawal to make sure that, anybody that was actively working with the zero units, anybody that was potentially going to be relocated or exfiltrated, that they had gone through continuous vetting through the time of the withdrawal. And so vetting was a continuous thing. They were really also good at self-policing, and what I mean by that is, if they sensed there was an issue with one of their teammates, they raised it and they talked about it. It wasn't something that was kind of brushed aside. This was a very well vetted unit, which is why in 20 years of the war there was not one green on blue incident. And just for your listeners, green on blue is when you have, for example, Afghans turning on US advisors, resulting in a deadly incident. In the 20 years of these units, there was not one green on blue. That is a testament to the level of vetting that was put into the units. Um, I can speak for myself. I mean, I worked with many different Afghan partner units during my time in Afghanistan. The zero units were one of them. But I mean, imagine being heavily outnumbered and outgunned, yet still, there was not one incident of a green on blue, and that speaks volumes to the level of vetting and trust that was shared amongst these units and their U.S. advisors. Um, in terms of your question about kind of what they did to contribute to the United States, I mean, when you think about some of the most high level terrorist leaders, when you think about some of the most difficult terrorist operations or counterterrorism operations, I should say, that happened during the war, the zero units were at the forefront of that. They were the tip of the spear. Think about the Haqqanis or the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS, building suicide, VBIDs, what we call, basically a vehicle that's been outfitted as a suicide bomb, or suicide bombers. I mean, there were complex attacks throughout the war. There were plenty of threats made against US and coalition forces, and the zero units were at the front getting ahead of those to keep Americans safe, to keep coalition forces and their own countrymen safe, right? If you talk to these folks, they'll tell you, my number one priority was to protect innocent lives, and that meant my US advisors, and that meant any other innocent lives. And so these guys and gals were really at the front of that. For them, I mean, I knew this from having had the experience of working for them, but their number one priority was always protecting and defending Americans. And so I think part of that comes from that ethos, that warrior ethos they have, especially if you think about those of your listeners that know Afghan culture. They call it Pashtunwali, which is essentially protecting, a guest. And for them, Americans were it was their responsibility to protect Americans. Like I said, they more than proved themselves on the battlefield. And while there was loss of life in 20 years for Americans, I mean, U.S. forces and even CIA officers, the zero units suffered 2 or 3 times more casualties during the war. And, if you had a separate memorial wall for them, there would probably be a lot more stars on it and to recognize their sacrifices.
Yeah. I am glad that you're shining a light on all of that because those are things that don't get talked about because it's such a secretive kind of unit, right? And I think we've talked about this before in the last episode, but I think it's worth bringing up for anybody who missed that episode. But the Taliban particularly loathed the National Strike Unit because of the effectiveness of them. And it makes perfect sense if you understand how the Taliban work and that, they need to go after anyone who really could degrade their effort. Any group that isn't able to be infiltrated for green on blue attacks that is so close with Americans is going to be a prime target of that. And that's exactly what happened. And some of that propaganda was so effective that people began to, it would leak out outside of just Afghanistan. So there is a lot of information out there about the zero units, but it's not accurate is what
It's
you
not
have always
necessarily
said.
true,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
100%. And at some point, Beth, I think we talked about this before. At some point, we should get you, get you in front of some of them to tell their stories because I think that's an important point that you make. I mean, the Taliban they could not outpower the zero units on the battlefield, but where it came to their propaganda, even today, the Taliban is extremely good at propaganda. Their online propaganda is, top notch. You should look at where it comes from because that would probably explain why it's top notch. But that was one thing that they were good at. They were good at discrediting the zero units or casting doubt, especially among civilians, right? Once you start putting those doubts into civilian minds, you can, that's how you start winning people over. And unfortunately, the Taliban were ahead um, of the zero units and the United States in terms of discrediting the zero units. But those that worked with them, those that could firsthand experience their sacrifices and their, quite frankly, their professionalism on the battlefield. These guys were not out there to harm civilians or harm their own countrymen. It was quite the opposite. They were there to protect their countrymen. And so, unfortunately, the Taliban did get away with discrediting them to some effect, which is why you read certain horribly done articles. I won't name any names, but very poorly done accounts that are not firsthand accounts. And I think it would be great to start getting at firsthand accounts from the units and from folks that had the opportunity, quite frankly, the honor to work with them.
And that's the hard thing too, though, is because,
Hmm.
I had the opportunity to talk with someone who worked with them and was very concerned about what can I say on the record about that.
Exactly.
And that is,
Yeah.
so then that adds another level of difficulty because how can you stand up for somebody if you can't say those things in
Yep.
public? And the things that they did say were so strong and so beautiful, but they couldn't go out. And
Yeah.
so it's really, really difficult. These individuals are in a really difficult situation. And you said this before, you mentioned this, and I think this is worth saying too, because when we spoke before, I had no idea there were women in the zero units. Tell
Yep.
me how many women and what was their role? Was it different from what the men were doing, or what were they there to do?
Very small numbers. I don't know the exact figure, but very small numbers. And some of those women were the toughest that I had seen in my career. I tell you, I had the opportunity to actually do some training with some of the women when this program the idea of embedding women into the units was first launched. And wow, it was pretty amazing how tough these women were. I mean, they could keep up with those long marches from where a force was dropped off to where they needed to get to to an operation, and some of those women could keep up. Some of them, it wasn't, that wasn't their role, was to be part of the fighting force. But what they were there for is to protect and secure women and children that were, on operations, because often you'd be going after a particular target, but there would be women and children there. And so because of the Afghan culture and certain customs involved, you wanted to have women in these units to be able to communicate and protect and keep the women and children safe. And so it made sense to embed women into these teams. And even at the withdrawal, you had, some of the women from these teams that were out there dealing with female civilians and children. So yeah, the women are the heroes too. Often the unsung heroes, because we say the guy, it just happens because there were so many men in the units, but there was a small number of women, and a lot of them are here now, and they're doing great things. It was,
That's so cool.
the point I want to also make on this is, uh, there's a certain culture within the zero units where if a soldier was killed in action, um, the idea was to continue. It was like a family, and so the idea was, soldier's been killed in action. He now has a widow and children who have lost, the source of income to keep the family going. And some of the females that joined the zero units were actually widows whose husbands had been killed in action. And so the husband's position, or so to speak, his spot was offered to his widow. And so yeah, some of them are they come from families where they had other relatives or a husband or somebody working in the units.
Wow.
And so yeah,
That's
hard, I
amazing.
would say tough women. Afghan women are tough women.
Yep, we do not credit in this overall in Western society. We have no idea the toughness that Afghan women have, and it's unfortunate the things that have happened to make them that way, but they are, and they're an unstoppable force, and will continue to be so when the Taliban get out of everyone's way, I think. Um, but
Well said.
that's a conversation for
Well
another day.
said.
Let's talk about the other part of why we're here. So it's so clear that, the zero units were we could not have done so many of the things that we did over 20 years without them, including at the very end. What about when they got here? You worked so hard because they had SIV eligibility to get them SIVs. What happened?
Oh boy. Oh,
I shouldn't laugh. That's not funny at all. It's just sometimes that's all you can do. So I
yeah.
apologize to
No,
everyone.
no, you're good. Um, oh man. So when they first arrived here, this would have been September-ish, October-ish, 2021. Famil, at that point, we had established a small team of volunteers. Many of us are former CIA officers, former U.S. military veterans, and then we had volunteers from different communities within Northern Virginia and kind of across the U.S. And what we were doing was going out to the bases. As you remember, Fort Dix, Quantico, Fort Lee, all the various bases. And so we were going out and meeting folks from the zero units and from other SIV communities, but we ended up doing a lot of work with the zero units. And early on, it was, look, they were told stay in the SIV process. You're eligible for it. Um, it is what we've planned for. So stay in the SIV process. This is kind of the guidance that they had been given by the powers that be. Stay in the SIV process. And so Famil, what we did early on was we got the best SIV experts onto our team, including from within the zero unit community. And we started helping them work through all of the various documents that they need. While so many of the zero units were interpreters, so many were not. and didn't have the language skills, didn't understand how to get through the paperwork process. It's quite burdensome if you don't speak the language, for example. And so we very early on started working with them to get them through the SIV process. It was challenging. I think for the first couple of years, so this would have been 2022 and 23, there were a lot of challenges. Part of it had to do with the volume. You're talking roughly 9,000 zero units plus their spouses and children. Somewhere over 30,000 individuals had to get through the paperwork process for the SIVs. So some of it was pure volume. The other part of it was that, at that time, there was the asylum pathway had been expedited for Afghans who came through the evacuation, but not the SIV pathway. And it's almost backwards, right? Because you think of your SIVs as your most vetted amongst the Afghan population that came here during OAW. And then within the SIVs, you look at the level of vetting and it's like, these guys are at the top. What's going on here? And unfortunately, there was an emphasis placed on processing asylum cases and refugee cases, getting more refugees out of Afghanistan to the US. And all that's good. I'm not saying that's unfortunate, but the unfortunate part is that these SIVs and more broadly SIVs were not prioritized.
Right.
Right. So under the Biden administration, there was a lot of focus put onto refugee processing, asylum processing, but not so much SIV processing. And that seems backwards.
Sure. Well, and I've talked to other people who had Afghans that they served with. Tom Schumann always comes to mind, whose interpreter saved his life in Sangin and came over during the withdrawal, right? And if anyone else raided an SIV, it's Zach. It's anyone who carried a U.S. weapon even though they weren't supposed to and protected our people. And Zach had a similar problem, I think, to some of others that had some employment with DOS Annex that couldn't be verified and couldn't show to the State Department's satisfaction that 1 year, but kept trying because they kept finding new people to provide LORs and whatever and kept pursuing SIV, because if you have the option for SIV versus asylum, you're going to want SIV every time. It's access to a green card. It's access to all these things that you earned. If you earned an SIV,
you said it.
You deserve the SIV, not the asylum. Yeah.
It's the I've earned it, right? And it's not an entitlement thing. It's strictly like, look, I put my hand up. I served with US forces or with the US government. Yes, I was compensated for it. It was my job. But because of that affiliation, that loyal and faithful service, my life is at risk.
Yeah.
And they've earned it.
Yep.
And you'll often hear, you'll hear stories about SIVs and their nightmare stories. And it's like, look, I was not a random civilian that fought my way into the airfield. I worked, I earned it. I went through a lot of years of service and sacrifice and vetting. And this was whether you want to call it a spoken or unspoken promise, but it was an understanding that as a result of doing X, Y, and Z, you would be eligible for an SIV.
Yep.
And so they've earned it. They've more than earned it. And they are more than eligible for it based on vetting. But like I said, unfortunately, during the Biden administration, this was not a priority. And so by the time we did a ton of advocacy around this, within the administration, with congressional partners, we did a ton of advocacy around this, and we made progress. I want to say we made progress. But by the time progress started being made, first of all, there was already a huge backlog of cases. And then, of course, there was a change in administration. And so when the new administration comes in, it has to look, what are we doing here? What do we need to adjust? What do we need to improve? What do we need to maybe step back from? And so, of course, we expected this, and we expected the Trump administration would look at this thoughtfully, and they have. And we've made significant progress with the Trump administration and getting the zero units where they need to be in terms of green card processing for those that didn't have 1 year of service, asylum processing. And we're still working through some of that now, but you know, the zero units have found a lot of hope with President Trump because he understands who they are and he understands what it means, um, you know, for these guys who arrived here legally, who the US government exfiltrated, who served in uniform, who believe in American values, and who are still contributing to this country today. And, the Trump administration gets that. And so we're seeing progress there where we hadn't seen it for many years. In fact, I'll show some good news. Just within the past several days, we've got cases that have been hung up since 2022 and 2023 that are finally getting scheduled for green card interviews. And it gives a lot of hope to the community and to the families of these soldiers that finally all of the service and sacrifice was not for nothing. We're finally getting to the point where we can have an identity again, where we can have permanent status, where we can be, you sometimes hear them say, I'm countryless.
Yeah.
I'm like a wanderer. I don't have a country. You get through the green card process and you get permanent status here, and suddenly you have a country that you can point to and you can say, this is where I belong again. So this is a huge deal for those that are finally getting scheduled through. Yet the other challenge we're working through, of course, and again, this is something that the Trump administration has been very supportive of, is in the meantime, humanitarian parole for these and for other OAW Afghans is expiring. It's expiring the month of August, September, October. And so what do you do in the meantime to make sure that people can maintain valid work authorization so they can continue supporting their families, maintain a home, put food on the table? And so that's the other piece of this, is that yes, we are making progress on the SIVs. Yes, the administration has been very supportive of resolving the issue of expiring work permits. At this point, we got to work through those fine details and how to do it efficiently and effectively.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're really focused on.
I'm so glad that you're having success in that. And, I remember with the Biden administration, the renewal of humanitarian parole came at like the nth hour. It was like, I didn't even know about it at the time because I had been so focused on what was happening for Afghans in Afghanistan
Mm-hmm.
that I had no idea that at home we had people like zero units waiting and without any, permanence. And so that adjustment of status came pretty late in the game for those folks back then, and now we're facing it. It needs to be. There have been so many residual difficulties because of slow processing and a failure to abide by our own guidelines with SIV. 9 months.
Yep,
9 months to recognize the fact that they are in danger.
yep,
And I think people thought that, oh, well, they're in the States, so they're not in danger.
yep.
And
That's
that's
this is exactly.
it's a
Yeah, yeah,
foolish consideration. But I also fell victim to it because it's like, oh, well, they're not, in the Taliban's crosshairs. But if they don't have status and they can't afford to feed their families,
yeah.
where else do
Yeah.
they go?
And that's unfortunately where we are now, right? So, like I said, the good news is this administration is working to resolve it and get ahead of it. Of course, the timing of this, it's tough because we're in the month of August, but I'm very hopeful. There's a small army of people. I think I'm on that army that just have a lot of heart and are pushing to get this done as soon as possible. And I have a lot of high hopes that we are going to get there. It's difficult. I will say Famil, my team, God bless them. They've been working tirelessly around the clock fielding phone calls, meetings, desperate, please, hey, I have children. I just got notice from my employer. I think, at this point we're at hundreds of zero units have been given job termination notices. Eviction notices have started. So this is a terrifying time for the community. But like I said, thank God for my team for just pushing and fighting and trying to keep me informed so I can have those conversations with both my board and with congressional partners within the administration as well to kind of get ahead of this.
Yeah.
It's so important that we get it right now, and I have faith that we are getting it right. It never should have come this far. It never should have taken this long. I mean, to think that we're 4 years after the evacuation and we still haven't figured this out for some of the most vetted SIV applicants in the history of this program, it makes no sense. But I have a lot of high hopes that we're getting ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely hope that that is correct. It's like you were reading my mind because my next question was going to be, when you started Famil, did you think you'd be here
Oh
four
my
years
gosh, no.
later? Yeah.
I can't believe it. I mean, when I started Famil, we had no idea the scale of this. We had no idea how many SIVs were going to be evacuated here. Uh, hadn't even thought about just the zero units. I mean, it was, Famil was set up to be a lifeline for Afghans who had served on behalf of the US government. Had no idea that we'd be, looking at a scale of 9,000 zero units plus their families. It's a huge number. Um, and like I said, in the early days, it was a very small team of us. We're still small, but we have a lot of heart. And the things that my team has been able to do across the country is just amazing. I mean, working with soldiers that were wounded in action, that's probably been one of my, like, it's been one of the most difficult but exciting parts of Famil's mission. Difficult because you're working with people that have lost limbs. You're working with amputees. You're working with guys that have severe gunshot wounds that are, partially disabled, in some cases fully disabled. It's very difficult, but exciting in that we're helping them get back on their feet. And we've talked so much about immigration, but I want to point this out. These soldiers, I still call them soldiers because my team calls them soldiers. They're some of the most resilient individuals I've met in my entire life. Missing a limb, some of them missing two limbs, helping them get back on their feet and get prosthetics, literally get back on their feet because they're like, I refuse to sit at home and accept handouts. That is not who I am. That is not how my parents raised me. That is not how I served in uniform. And by the way, even after losing my limbs, the unit gave me a job in uniform behind a desk. So I'm not going to sit at home in bed now and accept handouts. I've already got these 3 job applications lined up. I just need my legs again. And helping someone go from not having prosthetic limbs because they couldn't bring them here or they got damaged on the travel or whatever it was, to now being on their feet again. And my team has, myself included, have had the honor of going to physical therapy with some of our guys and like literally being there when they're taking their first steps. I remember those moments, and it is just an amazing experience helping someone get back on their feet. And we recently worked with somebody who he had severe gunshot wounds in his spine, and he's paralyzed. He's paraplegic, so paralyzed from the waist down. And he recently got his driver's license, and we helped him modify his vehicle so he can actually drive with hand controls now. And he is just the happiest person in the world. I actually met him in Afghanistan, then met him at Fort Lee after the evacuation, Fort Lee in Virginia, and then met him last year in Texas. And, he said, Blackbird, will you help me? I said, what do you need help with, brother? He's like, I want to get back into taking care of my family, and, I want to get my license stuff. we got it. We'll take care of it. And so we worked with him over the past year, and finally he's driving again, and he's able to get his family from point A to point B, doctor's appointments, schools, groceries, you name it. And now the next step is, well, he wants to work, and it's great. And he's been learning English, so we're getting him there. And so that's a very exciting part of what we do. Obviously, more help is needed because some of these folks are dealing with disabilities that are lifelong disabilities. And it's not just about, like I said, it's not just about getting a handout. No, they want to get on their feet. They want to work. Some of them want to study. So we're committed to helping them become self-sufficient. And so that's another cool thing that I look back on 4 years and say, like, I remember this was one of the first things that Famil's team highlighted to us. What the program manager for our Wounded Soldiers program, his name is Nasir. He was recently featured in Rolling Stone magazine. And Nasir, I remember one of the first things he said, Blackbird, we have to take care of the wounded soldiers. That is part of their ethos. It is taking care of their wounded soldiers. And so that's been an exciting part of the past 4 years. Obviously, the immigration stuff we've talked about, that's been a challenge. But really, I look at where we were 4 years ago and where we are now, and I'm so, so grateful for my team, first of all, for the guys that are working around the clock. I'm grateful for for my board and for our advisors that have kind of stuck with me in my hard days and been there on the good days, but also on the hard days. I'm grateful for some of our congressional partners that have really just opened huge doors for us to get through some of these challenges. And then, of course, we've worked across the administration for these 4 years, and I miss my own time in the government. I think this was a different world for me. I kind of, I wanted to do nonprofit work. I wanted to do work with veterans, and I feel like I'm doing both now. And so, but had it not been for all these people that have stood with us, I don't think, I look back 4 years and I'm just so, so grateful.
Yeah. Yeah. And you
Thank you for
clearly
asking me
have.
that question.
No, I just think it's none of this is what any of us expected, right? But like, I think when you just hit it, all the people who are standing there make it less burdensome. And, you're not going to quit on the people next to you. I think I referred to all of us in this entire community as like having a digital phalanx where, you're protecting the people beside you with the work that you're doing. And we're just all keeping on. And like,
Yeah.
there are we just have to keep going. And I'm so glad that you have that team, and you definitely have the marching into battle. You're doing the thing. You're pressing on. It would be so easy to say, I'm just done. It's been a long time, but you're not doing that. Your
I
team's
tell
not doing
you,
that.
my parents taught me two things. One was surround yourself with people who have the same heart as you.
Mm.
And if you do that, you're going to get through every battle. And the other thing was not so much of what they taught me, it was more of what my mom said to me once. She said, you are lead, follow, or get out of the way. And that always stuck with me. And I said, when she told me that, I said, Mom, I don't think so. That's kind of harsh. But hey, if that's what I am, that's what I am. I I believe there's a way to solve problems. And, if you can solve something, then jump into it.
Yeah.
I can't be faced with an issue and look at it and say there's nothing I can do. If I can do something, I'm going to jump into it. And so, um, whether it's starting Famil, whether it's the day to day, some of the most difficult cases that come our way, I mean, I will stay up late at night sometimes just thinking and strategizing and figuring out how do we overcome this problem. But what I won't do is simply walk away for something saying like, not my problem. No, we'll fix it. We'll find a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. So there's a lot of will here within my team, and we're working hard to find a way to get ahead of some of these things.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
are. It's incredible. I love getting to watch what you are doing, and I thank you so much for coming on to talk about this and
Of course.
shining this spotlight on these stories that people haven't been able to hear, and that
Yep.
hopefully as time goes on we'll be able to tell even more of them. And like
Yep.
you said, I'd
Yep.
love to get some of the zero units on here to talk about what they
Yeah.
did so that people can hear it firsthand. And Yeah. Do you have any parting words? Because I know we are at time. But anything,
You kept me
just,
on
yeah.
time.
I know. I'm,
Um, I think one challenge that we're looking ahead at next um, is family reunification.
yeah.
Probably what we'll talk about down the road, Beth.
Yep.
But we do have a couple thousand families from these units that are separated right now. Not all of them had the time and the ability to bring their spouses and children to Kabul from some of the more remote areas of the country. And so, unfortunately, um, thousands of spouses and children are currently separated. And that's something that we need to start really pushing on thoughtfully in partnership with the administration, because, of course, we want to be thoughtful about eligibility and vetting and all of those things that are so important to get right. But that is something that we're working on. We have had success in reuniting some of the families that have been through the SIV process. They're, the green card holders. Now it's about getting the spouse and children through the SIV process. So we've had some success on that, but on a smaller scale, just because it's such a heavy lift, super complicated process, which again we can talk about the next time. But that's something that we're looking ahead on and starting to kind of put into focus
Awesome.
for
Yeah,
yeah.
I feel like once again we're mind melding. I was gonna ask you about that, but I was like, no, Geeta ended it so hopefully. I'm not gonna go and
It's
stick a
hopeful. Listen, it's
pin.
super hopeful. I look at this as there's silver lining to all of this. It's difficult work, but there's always a silver lining, and the fact that we're making progress encourages me to continue. So,
Sure. And it's the
we,
reward of it, that knowing.
oh yeah.
Because without you, who would have done it?
Oh, I'm
Right?
hopeful that other folks would have jumped in and done it. So it's like I said, I can't take all the credit. I have a phenomenal team that's been fighting and supportive, and friends that have just gone out of their way to help us overcome some of these barriers, and I'm very grateful for them.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, you're right. But there are so many groups like Famil who jumped in and said, if not me, then who, right? And that's the thing,
Yeah.
is all those groups had their role. And if it had just been one of them, even, that they couldn't have handled the workload that was there to
Yeah.
be handled. So, yeah, everybody had their space in this. I think that it all happened for a reason. And I do think that the strongest people are built by adversity. And so it makes sense that your team, who already have such incredible experiences in life, having done what you've done, that you were poised for this moment.
Thank you. I
I'm
appreciate
glad to
that.
have you here, Geeta, and I can't wait to hear about the progress that I know is gonna come. And I want to thank everybody for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan, Tashapur, and hope to see all of you again soon.